Welcome. We'll get started. A few practical announcements as usual. By now you should be getting course emails from me, roughly 20 to 30 a day. If you haven't been receiving the course emails, the official emails that are numbered PCGT number 2, 3, 4, and so on, give me your email address today after the class on a piece of paper, and I'll add you to our system. We have a course dinner tonight at 6, Leverett's private dining room. For those wanting to look at the course videos from a site outside of Harvard, it's now possible to do so with a password, and I'll give you this password. It's top secret. It mustn't leave this room, but the login is Idealism 101. That's one word with a capital I, Idealism 101. Oh, yeah, Idealism space 101, as if it was a course title. And the password is courage. I hope you'll be able to remember that. I have drop-in office hours this Friday. That's the 27th. That is from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in Barker 308. And then tomorrow at 7:30, we are showing 3 short films in Science Center D. D as in despair. Tomorrow at 7:30, and the first of those films is called Occupation, and it's a documentary about the living wage movement at Harvard in the spring of 2001 and the takeover of the Harvard President's Office for 3 weeks then. A very, very riveting documentary, and many of the characters in the film will be familiar to you. And then we have another short film right after that.
Alice Waters and Her Delicious Revolution is part of the PBS American Masters series. Alice Waters is primarily responsible for the spread of the organic food movement and just getting more delicious food grown in the United States. She is the executive chef of Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley, California, and also responsible for the Edible Schoolyard project.
And then the third short film on tomorrow at 7:30 will be a clip of an interview with our guest this coming Monday, Dan Matthews, of the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. This is an interview with him by someone on National Geographic's television program. The interview very politely calls Dan Matthews a terrorist and other such things, and Matthews responds. Next week, on Friday, we are interviewing a couple of Harvard workers from the dining hall and custodial services, respectively, as well as Greg Halpern, whose book Harvard Works Because We Do is the one we'll be reading. They've asked me to alert you to a rally tomorrow at 5 o'clock outside of Holyoke Center for Harvard workers who are being laid off in large numbers at this time. Harvard, as you know, is running out of money, and there are various efforts to cut costs, and the costs are not being cut at the top of the pay scale. The investment managers, as you read in the Crimson, earn tens of millions per person this year, but instead the costs are being saved at the bottom of the pay scale. And for those who disagree with that approach, our guests want me to tell you that there's a rally tomorrow at 5 outside of Holyoke Center. Let me give you a brief quotation as we lead into today's interview from a book called The Money Motive, a study of an obsession from 1974 by Thomas Wiseman. He says that the saying is that time is money, but it is actually the other way around. Money is time. First, money is time in the sense that, for example, the cost of the American space program, expressed in tens of millions of dollars, is really time, the time put into it by all those engaged in the program. The real cost of anything is the time put into it by those doing the work. And this is a cost because hours of real lifetime are being used up. And then it goes on to say, I'm still quoting, of course, limited resources are being used up, but what this means is that future generations may be deprived of some or all of their lifetime. With that preamble, it's a pleasure to be able to introduce one of the world's leading experts on questions of economics and time. Professor Juliet Schor taught for many years at Harvard, was one of Harvard's most popular teachers, and until the anxious patriarchs of the institution let her go, and she is now a tenured professor at Boston College. Her books include The Overworked American and The Overspent American, national bestsellers, which made her an important figure on lecture circuits and in media discussions throughout the past 15 years. She's a noted speaker and an actively socially engaged economist. We may hear about her work also in founding an organization. So please join me in welcoming Professor Juliet Schor.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks. Looks like the class is growing.
It's
Great to see so many folks here.
exceeded the seminar room we had planned to use. We will go right into our first question from Andrea Leahy.
Thank you for coming today, Professor Schor. Why did you decide to research new consumerism? How did you become interested in it? And was there a moment during your youth or your education that significantly raised your concern about it?
Can people hear me, first of all? Should I turn the volume up? Oh, that's good. Yeah? How's that? Too much. Okay. Is this good? I got into it by accident, actually. I feel like I sort of backed into it. I was I was a radical economist studying, coming out of a Marxian economics tradition. And that meant that we studied production. And Marxists tend not to think too much about consumption historically, particularly in fields like economics. And I wrote this book, The Overworked American, the genesis of which was some theoretical issues in economics. And the book was almost all about the workplace and the pressures which were being placed on workers to work longer hours, and why it was that despite incredible productivity in our society and rapid growth of productivity, people were not getting more leisure time. And in fact, what I found as I started looking at the data on this, they were actually working longer hours. But that left an interesting question about the income that people were getting and what they were doing with it, and why it was that when there were surveys done to ask workers about the trade-off between money and work time, that is, or money and free time, most people said they pretty much liked what they had. So you didn't see a lot of dissatisfaction about hours of work. And so what I started to do was think about the spending side of it, because I thought, well, that must be important in understanding why people are so satisfied with the fact that they're working longer hours. and I developed what I called the model of work and spend. And that was in my first book. And basically what I found was that people's sort of preferences about money and consumption adapt to what's happening in their lives. So that when we ask workers about trading off whether they'd rather have a raise or they'd rather get more free time, very large numbers of workers said they'd prefer the free time. But then the system doesn't give it to them, and it gave them income instead. They spend the income and get kind of locked into or habituated to that higher level of spending. And when you go back a year later or 2 years later and ask them, they say they're happy with what they have. And what I argued is that happened over and over again in the post-war era. For any of you who have taken Ec 10, you'll know that this is the total reverse of the standard argument. The standard argument says people have preferences for consumption, and they exercise those in the market. They get what they want. And the number of hours that people work is a reflection of their preferences. So they're choosing their hours of work, and they're getting just what they want. What I argue is the system actually works in reverse, that workers ended up wanting what they had gotten, so that their preferences adapt to what's offered out there in the system, and that there's a lot of rigidity in the system, and they didn't have the opportunity for trading off productivity growth against leisure time. So I wrote that chapter in the Overworked American, but that was really just scratching the surface of the issue of consumption. I mean, what was really going on? I had a fairly simple model there. More and more people said to me, how do I escape the cycle of work and spend? And that led me to consumption. So it was actually rather late in life. When I came to Harvard in 1984, I had a pretty standard economist's view about consumer issues, which was that more is better. It's a simple story. We should grow as fast as we can. We can solve environmental problems through technology. Very standard. And I end up completely revising all of my views about those things and coming to a very different point of view after starting first from the workplace, but then looking at the consumer issues. Was that too long? Okay.
Debbie Doroshow.
Hi. Professor Schor, in your introduction to the Overspent American, you described the phenomenon of downshifting as an action that, quote, brings one's lifestyle into correspondence with one's values. So I was just wondering if you had ever felt a tension between your own chosen lifestyle as a university professor and the values that you personally choose to espouse. And if you have, how do you mediate that tension?
Well, I think actually job of university professor is one of the easiest for me to negotiate the disjunction between sort of my views and say the requirements of a job or the position that I have in society. That's not necessarily why I chose this profession, but we have a lot of autonomy. I get to teach what I want. I feel that I am able to use my occupation, both my writing and my teaching, to help contribute to the things I believe in and the social change that I believe in. So I think I'm lucky in that way. Not to say that there are no tensions, and certainly it also depends on where one teaches. I think teaching at Harvard was in some ways more challenging because of the particular role that Harvard plays in the reproduction of elites in this society, and its, very, very strong historic role in the governance of this country, and it's a very conservative institution. So, there were issues there. But for the most part, I would say it's a good choice if you're a person who has values which are at variance with the mainstream. I found it to be.
Can everyone hear in the back rows? Good. Next, we have a question from Janet Yue.
Hi. While our culture becomes increasingly overworked, there seems to be an pressing need to help those struggling at the very bottom. How do you think people gain a sense of social responsibility? And what environmental or personal experiences have caused you to obtain a sense of this social responsibility?
Could you just repeat the very first part of the question?
While our culture becomes increasingly overworked, there seems to be an pressing need to help those struggling at the very bottom.
Yeah, well, I think the growth of the need that probably most of us in this room feel to help those at the very bottom is also coming from the fact that over time the conditions of life for people at the bottom in this country are getting worse and worse, and that's something that's been going on for about 20 years. Not on every dimension, but if you look at the big picture, what's happened in this country is a dramatic shift from the first post-war period. So by that I mean post-World War II, say from 1945 to roughly 1975, in which as a society we were becoming more equal. The people at the bottom were getting closer to the people in the middle and the top, and conditions of life were improving. Increased access to health care, education, basic services, basic needs, and that sort of thing. Then, of course, we have a turnaround. Income distribution begins to worsen in the 1970s. Government policy turned sharply against the poor beginning in 1980 and toward a society which is creating more privilege for a small group of people and so on. You probably studied a lot about this. So the question was, social responsibility. Okay. I think one of the big challenges at the moment is to differentiate between a kind of charity approach, which is the dominant approach out there when it comes to issues of social responsibility, which is service and volunteering and coming out of traditions of noblesse oblige, in which it is the duty of the wealthy to help the people below and so forth, and traditions which address these issues, which are coming from a point of view which has a sense of what is socially just, what is ethical, and each of our own obligation or role in terms of making society a more just and ethical place. And it's the second tradition that I personally believe in and that I worry is being crowded out by the first. And the thing about the first is that it essentially leaves structures of privilege in place. And it says, in a world in which some people have so much, it's their duty to, give a little more to the people below. It doesn't question the basic structures that lead to such extremes of privilege and situation. So that's how I think about social responsibility. And your question was, how did I get there personally? It's a good question. When I was, what year was it? 1960. No, it couldn't have been 1960. Must have been 1964. I was 9 years old. I, like Nelson Rockefeller, I think he ran for president that year. Maybe it was he didn't run in 68. It must have been in 64. I just thought he was cute or something. He was a Republican. But the Vietnam War had already started, and of course it was starting to radicalize people who were conscious of what was going on then. I won't say I was radicalized by the Vietnam War, although I went to protest marches. I was involved in the movements of the 1960s. I was still in high school. I was young. But I was very politically active. I got involved with the United Farm Workers Union. That was my first big cause. They were a group of unorganized and very oppressed migrant workers, mostly from Mexico, who were being really exploited by the growers, mostly in California. But truth be told, I think, although I didn't know it growing up, my parents were both communists, and I think that's how I ended up the way I am. I found out when I was in high school, when they tried to control my political activity, they kind of had to come clean about their own. But I'm sure that's, in whatever subtle ways they transmitted it to me, that's where it came from. By the way, in the era they were communists. It was a much bigger movement, and it was a movement that was fighting for a lot of the things that liberals later came to fight for: racial integration, economic justice, union rights, the rights of workers, the rights of women, etc. It was very different than what we think of as communists today.
Tim McDonald.
Professor Schor, the New American Dream website, which you're connected to, advocates some changes that people can make in their lives to sort of slow down. And one of the things that they advocate is a media fast.
Is to what?
Is a media fast.
Oh, okay.
Going without maybe watching the news or reading the newspaper because they say there's a lot of negativity in the newspaper. Do you think there's a danger in that, especially if it was a regular occurrence in a voting democracy for people who choose to do a media fast and not stay informed of the events of the day?
Well, it's interesting. You've scoured the site more than I have. I haven't seen that. I would differentiate among different types of media. I think it's important to stay informed about what's going on. And I would distinguish between news and other entertainments. But of course, I think that if you really want to understand what's going on, you have to go, in terms of news, the internet is the place to find out what's happening much more than television. I don't know if their media fast includes also radio, but there's a lot of good stuff on radio. I listen to radio. The kind of people who mostly come to the center historically have been sort of stressed out, people in their sort of 30s and 40s who are typically living a pretty conventional American lifestyle and are trying to get out of it. So that's who that kind of a suggestion is aimed at. If you don't find that you're sort of enmeshed in a dysfunctional ways in media, then you may not need to have a media fast. But let me say one other thing about that. I've just finished a book on the commercialization of childhood, the growth of marketing to children, children's increasing immersion in consumer culture, and so forth. And one of the things I found is that mediated through a structure that I call consumer involvement, but that's a sort of psychological and social value system and psychic system. The more media that kids watch, both television and a variety of other media, electronic media, the more anxious they are, the more depressed they are, the lower their self-esteem, the worse off they are in a variety of ways. I also have the personal experience of raising two children essentially television free. And it's been a really, I think, a positive thing in terms of their upbringing. So I feel that you have to be really careful in this culture about how much media you watch, how much you let it kind of define your inner life, because that's a lot of what, in my research, I've found. I'm not sure whether you read this chapter of The Overspent American, but I think it's the third chapter, which talks about how people who watch more television spend more money and save less money. And I argue that it has to do with the impacts that television has on our sort of lifestyle desires. So like any other thing, it's an influence on people, and I think it's one that you need to be very conscious and sort of aware and proactive about rather than passive. We have something like, I think, don't quote me on this figure, I think something like 57% of U.S. households are what are called constant television households, that is, households in which the TV is on all the time. And although that doesn't mean people are glued to the TV all the time, there's a kind of way in which television especially has become a sort of constant backdrop in our society, and I think that's, probably something we need to pay attention
to. To stay with issues of children, we'll reverse the order of the next two questions. Boye Kesse first.
In both The Overspent American and Cleaning the Closet Towards a New Fashion Ethic, you identify not just adults, but also children as suffering from a need to constantly compare their own material possessions with those of their peers. As a mother, how did you cope with your own families and specifically your children's desire or need to fit in?
Needs to fit in, did you say?
Yes, fit in.
Okay. Well, I guess my kids won't mind if I talk about them in front of 600 people. I have two children. One is 12 years old, a boy. One is 8, a girl. As I just said, the first thing that we did was when my son was born, we decided to at least start him off without any television. Now, why did I do this? I talk about this a little bit in the book. It wasn't that I sort of felt kind of dogmatic about this and that, I could never let my child watch television. It's such a bad thing. But I felt, first of all, I wanted to get reading and love of reading really established. I felt that with young people today, there's so much electronic media that we are in danger of not reproducing love of reading. And that's something that my parents gave to me and I really think is very valuable, both as an entertainment and also as a critical skill. So that was my thinking at the beginning. Get him really into reading, and then if he wants to watch television, that's fine. Why was I worried about reading? Well, the research says that kids who watch more TV early on, it's harder to become good readers and avid readers and so on and so forth. So there's a sort of pushing out effect. And there's lots and lots of research on the impacts of TV on cognitive achievement and other things. I was less worried about that. But it turned out, so eventually, people were very hostile to me about this, by the way, when I talked to them about it. They got really defensive, and it was interesting. People kind of constantly warned me about, how horrible it was going to be when I could no longer control my child, and he was going to turn into a TV addict and this and that. A lot of people had a hard time with it. But so I sort of thought, well, when he asks for it, I'll give it to him, because I don't want to turn it into this forbidden fruit that then becomes the kinds of things that people were warning me about, and I just, I didn't want it to be a point of contention. I guess he was about 5 years old when, he asked about it, and I said, well, we don't really think television is very good for you, and sort of discussed why and so forth, and he took that pretty seriously, and that was fine, and never really asked. Recently, occasionally he can watch a sports event or something like that. But basically, and then, with the second one, she just kind of followed in the wake. So we've been able to raise these children basically television free. Of course, my husband and I had to stop watching television. You can't do it in a hypocritical way. And it's worked out really well. They're great at entertaining themselves. They do a lot of creative stuff. I feel their play dates with their friends are more active and so forth. So that's been a huge issue. And that was very positive because it got us out of all that, I want this and I want that, and all the advertising that is beamed at kids when they're young through television. For us, the issues have been around sort of what you might call materialism, kind of how much stuff we give to kids. We live in an affluent neighborhood where other kids get a lot of stuff, and so then our kids come home, and that's an issue. And for my son, video games. Now, that's not really a materialism issue, but it's more sort of what games can he play and what games are his friends playing and so forth. But, some of those same issues around fitting in come up with that. And it's, I would say it's something that you have to approach with a lot of concern for the individual child and a lot of thinking. When our restrictions become onerous to our kids, they let us know and we tend to step back. So, we've had, various times in their upbringing when they've been really upset about things that we don't do. And they've articulated why they want to do them and so forth. And typically we will respond to that. But overall, my view is that we are trying to create in our household and also to the extent possible with our friends, because you need to do it in a larger community too. I mean, if you put your kids always socializing with people whose values and practices you don't like, you're going to have problems. You want to put them in a context of people who share to some extent the kinds of values and practices you want to reproduce for your children. I know this is all very much in the future for all of you. But partly it's giving them the sense that we believe in something, that we think it's really good, and it's a positive. There's a positive aspect to it as opposed to just, you can't do this, you can't do that, you're not allowed here, you're not allowed there. Sort of that it's all about restricting and protection. It's about creating a cultural environment for them that's really giving them what we feel is positive, healthy, stimulating, creative, etc.
Tia Fernandez.
Do we want to use this other one? Is that too complicated?
Hi.
Hi.
So I was looking online and I dug up an old article from FM right before you left Harvard, and it was about the difficulties that the Women's Studies department here, which you were chair of, I believe, director?
Director and sometimes acting chair.
Faces with the institution of Harvard. So I wanted to ask you, as somebody who has had more radical viewpoints throughout your career, how you deal with the difficulties and sort of barriers that you might have faced from institutions like Harvard, for example, and how you manage to keep your momentum and your motivation and not get disheartened.
Well, partly you find other people who have similar views. So you have people who you relate to and talk to and act with. One of the things, if you see the film Occupation tomorrow, you'll see that, is it tomorrow you're going to see Occupation? About the sit-in, living wage struggle here, is that those of us on the faculty who supported the living wage struggle came together and acted as a group, as a faculty group. And that was a very empowering and positive moment for us. Women's Studies, we were able to do that also to a certain extent because it was a group of people who believed in the intellectual project of women's studies. And also some of us had political affinities, although that wasn't true necessarily across all of the women's studies faculty. So that was a really positive thing. I mean, one thing I felt, I came to Harvard in 1984 in economics, and I was full-time in economics for, 7 or 8 years before I also went into women's studies. And I had the experience there that probably most women faculty at Harvard had at that time, which is that we were very isolated, one of either the lone woman or one of very few women in our departments. And so we came together as women across all these different departments, and that was really important for us to be able to be here. Because those departments were often very, very difficult places to be for women. It's different now. It's better in most of the departments. 1984, there were very, very few women here. So that connection with others has been really key. I also came into Harvard with my eyes wide open. I mean, in the sense that I didn't expect a lot out of the institution. I think I had a pretty good understanding of its social role, and I had the view that it was an opportunity for me to be here. It provided great students and a good place from which to do work and to be heard with the kind of work that you have. So I also, and I think this is just an important part of life philosophy. I was grateful for the good parts about it.
Mike Getlin. Is Mike here? Okay, we will go ahead to spontaneous questions. Before that, I just want to let you know the theme for the short reflection on Professor Schor's work, and that is, how might you use Professor Schor's articles and interview to analyze your own current lifestyle and future plans? Again, how might you use Professor Schor's articles and interview to analyze your own current lifestyle and future plans? We open the floor now. Oh, I missed Tim McDonald. Where? No? Okay, wrong information.
Hi. I was wondering, I'm sorry, my voice is not very good, but I was wondering, a lot of times on the news I see consumerism linked with a better economy, especially when talking about holiday shopping and how is the economy going to fare depending on how much people are spending at the time. I was wondering if you, as an economist, do you feel that that is an accurate interpretation, and what do you think motivates this depiction on news coverage?
Okay, did everyone hear the question? It's about the idea that we are this sort of constant depiction of the need for consumer spending to keep the economy going, and that the consumer spending is the foundation of a healthy economy. People may also remember after 9/11 what the president came out and the thing that he said people could do to be true patriots was to go to the mall and shop, which, by the way, people did not respond to in terms of behavior. For lots of reasons, one of which was that most Americans, or many Americans, had a tremendous amount of debt, and particularly with the economy crashing, did not feel comfortable going out and adding more debt to their credit cards. There's a difference between the sort of what's the possibilities for an economy and sort of the way the American economy is currently structured. It is true that in recent years especially, we have shifted much more to a consumer-driven economy, and in particular a debt-driven economy, because a lot of that consumer spending is happening because of debt. We also have record levels of bankruptcy, longer hours, increasingly in part so that people can pay debts and keep up with these lifestyles and so forth. And we have more and more people devoted to marketing and advertising and increasing dollars going in that direction. I think when people like myself talk about the issues of the relationship between consumerism and the economy, and organizations like the Center for a New American Dream, our view is that that in fact there's a precariousness to this form of economy, and it has lots of bad impacts that we want to avoid, environmental impacts being central among them. But also, if you think about what's happened in this period that I've called new consumerism, but the last 20 years, and especially since the 1990s, increasingly you have money going towards luxury and status consumption and away from the satisfaction of people's basic needs. So we have an increasing number of people who don't have health insurance or access to good health care. We have our school budgets being cut all around the country. In the state of Florida, they have now made, I heard 12th grade is no longer mandatory as a way of cutting. Anyone from Florida here can confirm that? Is that true? Yeah. And it's not because all the kids are going to go early to college, by the way, after 11th grade. So education, healthcare, social services, high quality food as opposed to cheap fast food, a whole range of consumer products and activities that we're shifting away from the things that a fair amount of research tells us would do much more to give people well-being. So critics like myself say we need to change the foundation of the economy. And so in some ways, it's not so much about just spending less. A lot of it's about spending differently and about not growing at the maximal consumption rate, which is basically what we've been doing. So you sort of figure out what's the maximal rate of growth the economy can go. A lot of that is in consumption, and that's the path the economy's been on. You have plenty of examples of other economies in which private consumption is a smaller fraction of total economic activity. Other key issue about this is, well, let's say people agreed with me, they wanted to do less of this private consumption that we're spending so much effort on now. If we tried to cut back or tried to change, wouldn't the economy collapse? People worry a lot about that. The message that I'm giving, people say, well, wait a second, how can we have a healthy economy if people consume less? And I think there are sort of two ways to think about that. It's true that if I came in here and convinced you all not to spend money, and I was able to do that to everyone in the economy, and we cut up all our credit cards, and we were just going to live with, much more modest consumer spending, no question we'd have an economic collapse. But that's, of course, that's a really bad vision of to think about how it would actually happen. It happens gradually, and it happens largely, and this is what the chapter on downshifting in my book is about, largely because people decide they want to opt for more time out of the labor market. They want to earn less money, and they will therefore have to spend less because they're not going to be earning as much. But what that means is you don't have the same kind of impacts on unemployment that you would if you had a sort of sudden economic collapse of the type I just mentioned. So if you have a gradual shift towards shorter hours of work and downshifting in the labor market, you can actually shift to a different type of economy without chaos, unemployment, etc. I think that rather than urge people go to the mall and buy more stuff they don't really need, if we had taken the opportunity after 9/11 to say, let's pull together as a country, what are the things that people in this country really need that we could, devote time, energy, and money to, we would have come up with, that to me would have been really patriotic. More like what happened with the Second World War, and say, okay, we need to rebuild schools, we need to fix our healthcare system, we need to fix our foster care system. They're just really urgent needs in this country. We need to clean up our environment. Those are the kinds of things we can devote time and money to, which will give us, I think, more well-being. Speaking to the quote that Brian began with, money is time, meaning it's really a question of what, where we put our energies and efforts.
Professor Schor, many of us in this room see our time at Harvard as a place to learn to acquire as much influence as we can, to acquire the power to make a difference in the world through one or another means. And I'm wondering, could downshifting interfere with that? For example, shouldn't we all do our best to buy the fine clothing and hobnob with the right people to join the New York Harvard Club and there to be among the masters of the financial universe? Would a downshifting approach lead us in a different direction, away from the people who have the real dominance in our world?
Well, let me say first of all that the kinds of arguments I've made are not about sort of avoiding work or being lazy or couch potato or anything like that. What downshifters are doing is not just working less so they can lie around. Actually, most of them end up becoming much more active and engaged. They do a lot of community involvement or other things. I think you want to avoid an elitist attitude to your own life and your role in the world. Of course, Harvard encourages that elitist attitude, but in terms of thinking about your role in the world, social change doesn't come from persuading elites in the first instance to change. It comes in the first instance from activating, empowering, and organizing large numbers of people who have a stake in changing the system or whatever problem it is that you're mostly interested in. Elites end up playing a role in that, always. I mean, you look at big social changes, they typically happen in countries because elites get split. So if you think of the Great Depression and the kinds of changes that happened there, you had big splits in business. Vietnam War, splits in business. You haven't seen a lot of that in your lifetimes, but it may be coming. I think it's likely that over the next 10 years we're going to see increasingly shifts and splits within elites between the people who like the direction the country is going and those who don't. I mean, last year, for example, went to a conference of CEOs of major companies in a particular geographic region of the United States who were, the conference was about what they called the triple bottom line, and the theme of it was we can't just be about making money. We have to care about two other bottom lines, the environmental bottom line and the social bottom line. So here was a group of CEOs who were saying, we have to have a social commitment. We have to be good citizens. And that's, there's a split developing. And of course, if you're a person who wants to foster those splits and move them along, that's great. But it's, I think, as I think about effective social transformation of a progressive kind historically, it comes from the bottom up, and the elites also need to link to those larger, more grassroots organizations.
We have time for one more question.
Professor Schor, thank you so much for coming. My question is about public schools. Basically, as far as I can tell, public education is becoming less and less nonprofit. And I was wondering what you think about advertising in public schools. You were mentioning that with your own children, it's important to surround them with other kids and families who have similar values. But now if you go into a lot of public schools, Coke has a contract. And the reason is because there isn't enough money and so for public education. And so now kids go into schools and materialism and consumerism exist there. Also, as a product of public education, I know that there were a lot of classes where we watched TV and videos because there was a shortage of teachers or substitutes or whatever. So I was just curious about what you think about privatization in connection to public education.
Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you for not asking me about my clothes. I realized when I came here today that you'd read Cleaning the Closet, so I thought for sure someone was going to ask me about my clothes. And that's the last question, right? So I've gotten free, gone through unscathed. Okay. Well, I've written a chapter on this in my book. You won't be surprised to hear that I think that advertising in schools is something that should be forbidden in public schools. It's important to see the context of this. This also started in the 1980s, and there are sort of two wings to the commercialization of public schools. First of all, how many people here went to a Channel 1 school? What's that? You're saying, what's a Channel 1 school? Okay, a small percentage of kids here went to a Channel 1 school is a school that has an exclusive contract with a company called Channel 1, which gives television monitors to schools and VCRs in return for mandatory viewing of a 10-minute quote-unquote news, mostly not, broadcast and 2 minutes of advertising every day. So it's contractually something like 40% of students in high schools in this country are in Channel 1 schools, but they are disproportionately low-income and racial and ethnic minority students, which is why not such a huge fraction of you all were in Channel 1 schools. But this movement starts in the 1980s, and it's not only about opening up a captive audience to advertisers, which is very important for advertisers because of all the clutter on television and so forth, but it's also about a very concerted effort supported by Republican administrations since 1980 to privatize public education, to turn it into a for-profit enterprise in order to make a lot of money. And that's a lot of what's driving the testing movement. Of course, the public rhetoric is about standards and improving school and all of that, but people close to this president own the companies that are getting enormous sums of money through these testing contracts. It's another way of siphoning money out. The same person who started Channel 1 is very key in the formation of for-profit schools, including charter schools, and a lot of the school reform is about taking this area and making money off it. Same thing that's, of course, happening in healthcare. Same thing that's happening in the military. The Pentagon is now doing a lot of contracting with private companies for new, not just weapon systems, but actual people. And it's a wholesale attack on the notion of public provision and an attempt to open up all of our economy to corporate interests for the purpose of making profits. And I think, particularly when we're thinking about public services, the purpose of which is to serve the people, because it's our tax dollars which are paying for them, it's a really problematic development. Thank you.
Professor Juliet Schor, for bringing to us analyses at once lucid and liberating. We thank you.